The biggest drop in religiosity between generations ever recorded. 4 in 10 Americans between the ages of 23 and 38 now say they are religiously unaffiliated. That statistic is taken from a Pew Research article from 2022. Dire, isn't it? But why such a drastic drop? What makes someone leave a religion? Leave the church? Now, to a certain extent, lost sheep are a fact of life. When even one of the 12 apostles managed to turn away from the faith, it seems a simple fact that someone a few thousand years removed could make the same error. That simple fact, however common, cannot simply be brushed aside. We have a duty, mandated by the creator of the universe, to be salt and light, to produce good fruit. And in that pursuit, we must prevent all preventable mistakes, cure all curable ills, and correct all correctable errors. Correctable errors that lead to hypocrisy, hypocrisy that leads to disillusionment, and disillusionment that leads to faith lost in the church, and faith more often than not then lost in God. Small inconsistencies building up over time, stacking straws on a camel's back. When speaking about his childhood, Abraham Piper, the ex-Christian son of theologian John Piper, once said he had a mustard seed-sized lack of faith that blossomed over time into full-on faithlessness. The question is, what starts these seeds of doubt? And while we may never be able to root them out fully, what we can do is limit the extent to which Christians sow the seeds of our own decay by examining the seemingly inconsequential negative actions taken by the church and how it damages our character. It is my intention in this speech to take an honest look at the church's mistakes over the years, without bludgeoning you with angry or bitter words. Christians have sinned against the world. Christians have also given good fruit to the world. The two ideas must coexist. I cannot, however, give equal time to the good of Christianity while still thoroughly analyzing our errors. And so, for the most part, I trust that you know the truth and love of Jesus Christ. And guided by that knowledge, we as Christians must examine the church's hypocritical actions in the past, their effect on the world's perception of Christianity, and change our behavior in order to effectively continue spreading the gospel throughout the coming years. Over the next 20 minutes, I'll look at political radicalization, looking specifically at nationalism, Islam, the LGBTQ community. With each, we will examine the effects that they've had on the church, and then discuss changes that Christians should make moving forward. Before going any further, allow me to clarify a few terms. I'll use the term Christianity constantly. Now, this is such a wide umbrella that though some of what I say applies to the church as a whole, most of it does not. And so today I'm specifically talking about evangelical Christianity. I will use both they and we in reference to Christians. To be clear, I myself am a Christian. Additionally, because of the impact that various cultures have had on Christianity, today we're looking at Christianity in America, as the issues that Christians face here differ dramatically from issues faced by Christians in other parts of the world. Our issues are nationally based, and they are not inconsequential. Though the church's membership numbers have risen and fallen in the past, statistics suggest an extreme future drop. The Pew Research Center found that if trends hold, the Christian population in the U.S. will shrink from 64% to just above 1/3 of all Americans by 2070. These numbers show the downward spiral of the American church. Another study found that a century ago, the global north, commonly defined as North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, contained more than 4 times as many Christians as the global south. Today, more than 1.3 billion Christians live in the global south, compared with about 860 million in the global north. That 2011 study shows the drastic changes that have taken place over the last 100 years. And while it is comforting to see Christ's kingdom explode in other countries, the fact remains that it is diminishing in America. And if the last 100 years have been a time of drastic change, well, then the last few decades have seen the political scene undergo a special metamorphosis. Widespread radicalization has transformed politics, and the effect that this has had on the church is nothing short of disastrous. Now, while politics have always been tumultuous, in the last decade things have reached a breaking point. According to an NPR article, the trend of youth leaving the church picked up in the 90s, and it may not be a coincidence that this coincides with the rise of the religious right and more associations between Christianity and conservative political ideology. Exacerbated by wars in the Middle East and horrifying events like 9/11, we've reached a point where genuine conversations feel like a thing of the past. And a side effect of this is the simultaneous polarization of Christianity, which goes along with an unhealthy dose of nationalism. Now, the Encyclopedia Britannica defines nationalism as an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation-state surpass other individual or group interests. Christianity and nationalism make a nasty pair, and attempting to combine the two forces the thinkers into a strange doublethink mindset. As anthropologist John Bielecki puts it, Christian nationalism is envisioning Christians in the United States as both an entitled majority and an embattled minority. This forces the embattled minority to stick to one another because now every situation is one of life and death. In order to conform to what these nationalistic beliefs dictate a good Christian does, Christians sacrifice their convictions in order to conduct themselves in a certain way, confusing their politics and their religion. The problem is not with political convictions. Everybody has those. The problem is saying that if another Christian disagrees with your political convictions, then they are not saved. The problem is drawing lines in the sand that shouldn't be there. And these lines are most often drawn around attempting to preserve America's status as a Christian society and nation. But America is not and never was a Christian nation because a Christian nation cannot exist on earth. Galatians 3:23 says, "For in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." Now, the Jewish people were an incredibly national people, not because they had a closed religion or because they jealously guarded their borders, but because they were the chosen nation of God, set apart, distinct from everyone else. If Paul is telling the Jewish people that their Jewishness no longer matters in the face of Christ's sacrifice, how much more should that then apply to Christians in America, which was never God's chosen nation? The geographical location of Christianity has never mattered. Christianity is global, and against the span of eternity, America doesn't even register as a blip. The defense of America, however, has been at the top of the government's agenda since the attack on the World Trade Centers. The consuming desire for violence and vengeance against Islam and the resulting Islamophobia reflects an un-Christian attitude towards our neighbors and our enemies. Muslims in America face far more discrimination than Christians do, often at the hands of Christians. A survey by Gallup found that at 48%, Muslim Americans are by far the most likely of major faith groups to say they have faced racial or religious discrimination. 9/11 was an atrocity, and it is good that those responsible were brought to justice. But America, as it often does, went overboard in its discriminatory reaction to all Muslims, in spite of the fact that the vast majority completely disavow any kind of terrorist group. Now, the fear and anger at the time is an expected reaction, and many Christians did not themselves act in any sort of heinous or even particularly rude way towards their Muslim neighbors. Sins of omission still count in God's rulebook, however. The Pharisee and the Levite on the side of the road didn't hurt anyone, and yet are still judged harshly in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Christians have proclaimed themselves to be God's people, equipped with the knowledge of true love and kindness, and so when we fail to act rightly, we betray our God and any who look up to us. Now, some would say that anger towards terrorism is just, and this is true, but Christians are called to love above all. The Christian reaction demands that we take on the wrath of God, but forgets that judgment is God's domain and we are to cultivate his forgiveness. Our actions should be those of love, not anger. As Tim Keller puts it, Christians emulate the Jesus of the whips in the temple, not the Jesus who said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And Keller has it exactly right. Jesus' anger in the temple was due to the perversion of the worship of God. It was just. It was perfect. But this example that Keller uses is taken from a moment in the Gospels where a crowd brings an adulterous woman to Jesus and asks him if they can stone her. Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin throw the first stone." Could any of them have thrown it? None of the sinners, perhaps, but Jesus never sinned. He could have thrown that first stone, and it would have been right, and it would have been just. But he didn't, because violence, and particularly violence motivated out of anger, is not a Christian act. It is not our job to wreak retribution on our enemies. And when we lose sight of that fact, those who are watching us, our enemies, our neighbors, and our children, see hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is not the only thing born of politics, however. Unnecessary walls built up between politics and religion, forcing that kind of choice, have risen too high, and many youth, when faced with this decision, drop their religion. Political polarization between right and left, conservative and Democrat, has grown to a point where Christians have planted our flag in one side while condemning the other. And when we do that, we condemn ourselves. We condemn ourselves to an unchristian mindset and lifestyle. Now, this issue typically comes down to abortion. The other issues are thrown in there, sure, gay marriage, healthcare, you name it, but abortion has been the hot button subject for decades now. It is not the only issue on the table, however, and it's not the only issue concerning life and death. And so when we set up these barriers within Christianity, we alienate those who may need Christ the most. And we do not account for the other issues that people, particularly young people, feel convicted by. Issues about immigration and healthcare and racism and policing and so many more are at the forefront of many young people's minds. And when we build unnecessary ties between Christianity and one political side, we only build walls where we should be opening doors. When Christians hitch their carts to the horse of republicanism only, we find ourselves having to justify the unchristian actions of those we find we now have to support, or else damage our reputations as Christians. Keller once again puts it succinctly, saying, "Religion transcendentalizes ordinary cultural differences so that parties feel they are in a cosmic battle between good and evil. It raises the stakes. As one side makes a monster out of something, the other rises up to defend it. And this is radicalization, when it is unthinkable to think differently, to wonder about or converse with or consider other perspectives. And this is especially evident in the church's treatment of the LGBTQ community. The church's treatment of this community shows a lack of love and empathy that has led many young Christians to leave the church. Now, many Christians make the mistake of thinking of this gay community as an amorphous enemy of the church. This is simply not true. In reality, the gay community is your child, your friend, your sibling. And contrary to the belief that they are the church's one enemy, the church has damaged them far more than they have damaged us. LGBTQ youth are disproportionately more likely to become homeless, making up 20 to 40% of the homeless youth population and only 5 to 10% of the total youth population. This is not an issue in legislation. It's an issue with families that would rather kick their child out of the house than accept them as part of the gay community. Now, many Christians like yourselves wouldn't even consider kicking your child out of the house. The situation is still dismal for those youth that have homes, but parents who believe they are fundamentally broken. According to a 2009 study, gay youth reported higher levels of family rejection in adolescence, were 8.4 times more likely to have attempted suicide than their gay peers who did not experience family rejection. The more negatively a parent reacts to their child coming out, the more likely that child is to commit suicide. One author of a journal analyzing spiritual abuse recounts her own experience as a young lesbian in the church. She says, quote, "I grew up sincerely believing I was perverse against nature, an abomination, and that God hated me, this intrinsic part of me that I could not pray away or change." This hatred of herself, fueled by her church and by every adult around her, resulted in a suicide attempt. And as shown by the previous study, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. The church has created such a hostile environment that its own youth, born and raised in the love of God, are driven to suicide by their fellow Christians. Now, these issues that I've covered so far, nationalism, political radicalization, the gay community, apply to all of you. Not because you are preaching hate or storming the Capitol, but because all of us are part of the church. When one part of the church claims to speak for all of us, and we do not disagree with them, our silence is taken as tacit agreement. Anything they say is attributed to the whole. The solution is not to change our beliefs, but to clarify them. Why would a Christian child be afraid of their parents? What have we done to inspire this lack of trust, this fear in our youth? It's simple. We didn't speak out against our brothers and sisters when they spoke unfairly about people that they didn't understand, people that they decided were our enemies. It's because these children fear that by sharing a belief or a question or a realization about themselves, they will become the enemy that is so hated by those they want to trust. Now, stepping aside from that for a moment, some people would say that the solution to this is not to try and appease anyone, but instead to stand firm by the beliefs that we've held for centuries. Now, this statement, while true on a surface level, lacks nuance. Now, they would say rightly that Christians have always been separate from society. In John 17:14, Jesus, speaking about Christians, says, "The world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world." How many Christians have been martyred for their beliefs? This, they say, should be evidence to stand firm in an earthquake, rather than swaying with the tremors. Historically, however, the church has adapted to societal change, and in some cases was unchristian when it did try to stand firm. Specifically with the civil rights movement, many evangelicals opposed desegregation, making biblically based arguments to support their claims. According to a Counterpoints journal concerning race, religion, and America, while there were white Christians who took part in civil rights protests, there were rarely evangelical Christians. Rather, they were Northern liberal Christians and Catholics. Southern evangelicals typically sided against Black evangelicals. Jerry Falwell, for instance, the co-founder of Liberty University and a cornerstone of the evangelical movement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, strongly opposed racial integration. In a 1958 sermon, he preached that a curse was put on Ham, the son of Noah, saying Ham was, quote, "the progenitor of the African or Ethiopian or colored race." Notice the curse that was put on the Hamites. They were cursed to be the servants of the Jews and Gentiles. The true Negro does not want integration. He realizes his potential is far better among his own race. Who then is propagating this terrible thing? This terrible thing he refers to is, of course, racial integration. Now, this is not meant to be a perfect mirror. Merely, it's supposed to illustrate the fact that Christians have disagreed on every socio-political issue for centuries, and we have the verses to back ourselves up. Instead of trying to react to the culture and not conform to that, Christians should ask themselves, what will do the most good? This kind of reactionary thinking ignores the scope of Christian history, combining arrogance, hypocrisy, and radicalization, choosing to dig our grave deeper rather than listening and considering. Now, these are serious charges that to us seem unfair. When others speak about us in bad faith, assuming malice, assuming ignorance, assuming evil, it's difficult to keep a cool head and not react in kind. Christians are called to humility, not to seek our own good, but the good of others. Instead of meeting differing opinions with arguments, Christians should seek to foster relationships built on mutual respect and understanding. In her book, The Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert, Rosaria Butterfield, who was a lesbian who converted to Christianity, recounts her own experience coming to the faith with a relationship with a pastor and his wife. Now, she says in this, from 1997 to 1999, she simply read her Bible, had conversations, and pondered things in her heart. She was not a Christian during this time. And the pastor and his wife did not pressure her to come to church or to change her beliefs. They didn't try and gospelize her when they had no relationship with her. Souls are not saved through arguments. Rather, Christians can show themselves to be trustworthy, loving individuals, making relationships built on respect. But what does this mean practically? Well, for starters, pronouns. Whether names or pronouns, Christians should use the terms that a person gives them in order to foster respect in that relationship. Put aside for a moment your immediate problems and instead focus on opportunities. How can we expect someone to truly listen and consider the things that we're telling them if we have not shown them that basic respect in something as simple as what they ask us to call them? In fact, making an effort to respect that, even though they know that we don't agree or approve, will do more to show your sincerity in wanting a genuine relationship with that person than anything else you do. The effort is what yields the reward. In difficult conversations like this, we often have to step outside of our comfort zones. Christians should take that first step. When we decide to die on the hill of something as inconsequential as what word we use to refer to someone, we lose the opportunity to build relationships with God's children, and additionally have proven to those watching that we have boundaries set for who we will and will not respect. Instead of fearing disagreements or doubts within the church, Christians should make an environment where discussions and questions are encouraged. God is not fragile. His love is not fragile. His truth is not fragile. If someone has a question or a doubt or a problem, it is not dangerous to let them ask. What is dangerous is letting these questions go unanswered. Fostering a place of peace, respect, and safety is the answer. Calling out our brothers when they speak in cruel ways, placing the emphasis on loving the sinner rather than hating the sin, and trusting that Jesus will lead us down paths of righteousness. This is what will help us grow. Christians need to make an effort to express the love given to us by Jesus, because it is our calling, and because the consequences of doing otherwise are sending souls down the wrong paths. Christians have the truth. We know love. And when we fail to live this out in public and in private, it erodes trust in the church. Let our words match our actions, and our actions match the love given to us by Christ. This is not just a call to the church in general, it is a call to all of you. The world is changing. We can't stop that. The only path forward is to grow in kindness, humility, and understanding. As Christ said, all of the law and the prophets comes down to this: loving the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself. Thank you.